Australia for a conversation with Rob Norman. His book is especially interesting to me, and I know it's going to be interesting to lots of you. It's called Oscar's Amateur Radio Adventure. And automatically it conjures up all kinds of images for me. We had a great off-air conversation about his journey with what we call often ham radio. Rob, thanks for coming on.
That's all right, Kate.
So let's talk about why you wrote the book first. What was it that made you decide, okay, I've done this for 50 years. I came up with this story. I'm going to pull this story together. I'm going to write this story. What was it that motivated you?
Well, it's sharing the story, and it's demonstrating how an interest can motivate you to go forward and pursue something which to you is important. So it's really about finding a passion in life. It's about finding something that lifts you up, that encourages you, and that's very important, no matter what, because in the dark times, when you really go through negativity of one form or another, you really need something which you can turn to on a regular basis, which lifts you up, which gives you some sort of hope. And I think amateur radio was certainly that for me. And Oscar's Amateur Radio Adventure, the novel, it shows tells the story about a 14 or 15-year-old boy called Oscar and his journey from reading a book to becoming an amateur radio operator. And the final chapter is about his journey into the Australian outback, where he meets an amateur radio operator there who operates his radio station using solar power. And it's meant to create a feeling of warmth and enjoyment, and to give the reader a good time, to help them to feel good.
And so at 14 or 15 for Oscar, this was great to be able to escape into this world, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And in my case, I was about the same age when I read a book in the high school library written by a United States lady. And she described, it was called Adventures in Electronics. And she described, and this was a fictional story too, she talked about a young amateur radio operator living next door to another young boy, and how he jumps a fence and eventually makes friends with this amateur radio operator. So that book inspired me, and so I then looked into the hobby of amateur radio and what have you. And at the time, a friend of mine lived across the road. His name was Lee. And we'd usually, or sometimes, go down to the local rubbish tip, and we'd walk over the huge mounds of rubbish, like in those days. That was a long time ago. And at one stage, I found an old shortwave radio, a tube-type radio, and I put it on the back of my bike, and we rode back home. And eventually, I was able to get that going, and listen to amateur radio operators around the world talking to one another. And that really fired me up in the direction of amateur radio.
I bet. And you met some interesting people, because that's what happens along the way. You have to tell us a couple of those stories. Will you share a few of those with us?
What was that, Kate?
Tell us some of the stories of the people that you met through your amateur radio experiences.
Oh, okay. Firstly, the very first day I got on the air, I'll talk to a chap in Como, Western Australia. He would have gone by now. But the way he welcomed me onto the air when I told him that this was my first day stays with me to this very day, 50 odd years later. He was so friendly, and I just felt so great after I'd talked to him. That's one of the highlights, and that's the power of friendliness. And I did make a few friends in those early days too. One chap by the name of Les Catford, and his amateur radio call sign was VK5SW, and he lived about 20 miles away from me here in Adelaide, in the capital city of South Australia. Anyway, we became friends on the radio, and he was a retired farmer and asked if I'd come around and adjust his amateur radio antenna, which was up on a tower at about the 40-foot mark. And so I did that, and I had lunch with he and his wife, and that was a great experience. And also, while I was there, he showed me this huge antenna which was lying on the ground, and he asked if I wanted to buy it from him. And I eventually did, actually, and then we had it delivered here on the back of a semi-trailer, if you know what that is, like a huge truck. And then I used that antenna as time went on. But also a couple of other things. I made a few friends in the early days on amateur radio, friends overseas. For example, I talked to a chap in Japan, and we had a regular basis of a Saturday afternoon. I won't say regular basis, I mean a regular contact or conversation. So he tried to teach me Japanese, and I tried to teach him English, but about all I can say is sayonara. And another amateur radio operator whom I made friends with on the 7 megahertz band, I can't remember her name, but she lived in Lima, Peru. And I remember that she was a nurse, and we had a weekly schedule. And also we'd exchange letters with one another. This is way before the internet and what have you. And so we'd send letters to one another and, you know, saying g'day and good to talk to you on the air and what have you. So that's some of the types of things that can happen. But amateur radio is so diverse these days. I mean, the sky's the limit. There's so many different things that you can do. For example, you can bounce radio signals off the moon, and then they come back and are received on the other side of the Earth. That's called moon bounce. And there's a full-time amateur radio station on the International Space Station, and the astronauts up there who are amateur radio operators talk to school children on Earth. So many different things. I mean, for example, of course, Morse code, that's going way, way, way back. In my day, I had to learn that to pass the exam, but you don't now. And so there are different grades of licenses now, possibly 3 or 4, depending on where you live in the world. And so children as young as 8 or 9 can become licensed amateurs. They have a certain grade of capabilities, if you like. And so, I mean, the sky's the limit. Sky's the limit. You can do anything. I mean, you can send pictures around the world on radio called slow scan TV. And we have our own satellites. You can work satellites by pointing your antenna at the satellite as it goes over. There's so many amateur radio satellites. If you're interested, if you'd like to have a look at an amateur radio website, have a look at mine. It's been up there for some time now. My amateur radio call sign is VK5SW. So that's Victor Kilo Figure 5 Sugar Whiskey, VK5SW.com, and that will give you some information. And I've also written a book called A Short Introduction to Amateur Radio with Pictures. And I also have 6 amateur radio related books which are up for sale.
Wonderful. So you have those books where you can learn more about amateur radio. Then you have this novel about Oscar's amateur radio adventure. And I think you've really said it, the power of connection and the power of connection in the book. But I guess you obviously want people to enjoy the book, but what are some of the takeaways you hope people walk away with that are listening to us that read Oscar's amateur radio adventure?
Well, I think the bottom line is that it's up to you. If you want to pursue something, you've got to do that. And I think that you need to find a passion. It doesn't have to be amateur radio, as in my case, but you need to find something which you really like And so in the dark times, you can turn to that, and that will hopefully lift you up somewhat. So amateur radio is a wide field of interest. It's not just a matter of talking on the radio. There are so many other things you can do. Lots of us build our own circuitry, like receivers or transmitters, that's part of the fun and part of the basic interest, I think. And by the way, I must say that women and girls are also amateur radio operators. This isn't just about blokes or men or boys. So what was I saying?
That it could be for anyone.
Yeah, that's right. Look, it doesn't matter who you are, what age you are. You can become a licensed amateur radio operator.
Right.
Look, there's plenty of websites out there too if you're interested. But a lot of my books, if you have a look at them, there are 6 in total. The last one I wrote was called Beyond the Storm, and it's about a 17-year-old boy who is an amateur radio operator, but he lives with his mother and stepfather, and the stepfather abuses the mother. So amateur radio's involved in it too. I think you'll find that interesting, and that's topical because it deals with abuse, and I think it's important that we talk about that.
I agree 100%. And you can find, of course, Oscar's Amateur Radio Adventure. You can get that on Amazon. You can look Rob up, as he told you, his website. Rob Norman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Kate.